Good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone. First of all, I want to acknowledge the presence of all of you in this side event. I'm thrilled to welcome you to have this important event in which we are going to discuss the meaning of inclusion for people with psychosocial disabilities in different dimensions of social, political, and economic life. I want to give my biggest appreciation to the organizers of this event, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, to the World Health Organization, the civil society organizations Yo También, She Rights Women, ENOSH, Human Rights Watch, for making this event possible. And today we have the privilege to have so many experts on the rights of persons with disabilities and human rights in general, specifically in the promotion of rights in different areas such as health, political participation, employment, access to justice, and holistic approaches to providing mental health services and support, as well as independent living. In this event, we will be exploring the meaning of inclusion for people with disabilities, with psychosocial disabilities in different areas of the public life. And the idea is to identify what are the main barriers for inclusion, and of course, the possibility of good practices and overcoming those barriers. So let me make some preliminary announcements. The participants will have 7 minutes for their participation, and I will ask them to turn off their cameras when they are not speaking and their microphone. And turn them on when they are called to the floor. Later, we will have a space for questions, and I would ask if you have questions to please put them in the chat box. And if you want to speak at the end, we will be able to open the microphone for you. And of course, we ask for your patience and tolerance because we're not going to be able to take that much questions. Having said that, I would like to welcome Madame Marta Delgado, Mrs. Marta Delgado, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Madam, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos Rios Espinosa, Senior Researcher and Advocate Disability Rights in the Division of Human Rights Watch. Michelle Funk, Unit Head of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Use at the World Health Organization. Stephen Trommel, Senior Disability Specialist of the International Labour Organization. Huga Uheifo, Founder and Executive Director at the She Rights Women, Nigeria. Katia D'Artigues, Yo También organization in Mexico. Diana Schenbaum, Coordinator of Disability and Justice Program in Documenta, Mexico. Bhargavi Davar, Convener, Transforming Communities for Inclusion in Asia. Liran David, Director of the International Relations and Development at ENOSH, the Israeli Mental Health Association, and Vincent Gerard, Public Health Research Unit at Aix-Marseille University. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege for me being here today on behalf of the government of Mexico. It's an honor to participate in this relevant meeting within the framework of the 13th Conference of the States Parties to the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I would like to begin my intervention by thanking Human Rights Watch for the invitation to the government of Mexico to co-sponsor this meeting, which allows us to continue working in favor of the rights of persons with disability, which indeed is a matter of my personal interest. I will be very edifying. It will be very edifying to be able to hear firsthand from the experts from this panel who accompany us today, their experience and knowledge in this matter. As you know, historically, Mexico has been characterized as an active promoter of initiatives like this one. aimed at promoting and protecting the human rights of people with disability. And also we are facing right now challenges for the accomplishment of our commitments, and we need to speed up our own work in the government, such as activities Mexico has been undertaking in the last years are, for example, the leadership assumed, which culminated in the adoption of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the General Assembly of the United Nations. That happened in December 2006. 14 years after this historic event is the international community's obligation to redouble efforts for its effective implementation. Likewise, it is time for those states that are not yet party to the convention to favorably consider their adherence. It is also a diplomatic work for us to convince them to join in order to achieve universal participation in this treaty. With regard to the Mexican state, multiple actions have been carried out in the last decade that have aimed to include the issue of disability practically in all spheres that make up the Mexican government structure, as well as the most important multilateral forum. I do believe that the role of Mexico in the multilateral arena has been very, very important. The leadership is there. As an example, I particularly highlight the work within the framework of the Human Rights Council, where jointly with New Zealand, a resolution on rights of persons with disability is presented every year in order to approve and monitor compliance with the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. From our perspective, disability is a complex phenomenon that is not limited to the particularities of the functioning of a person today, but results in the interaction between people with disabilities and the tangible and intangible barriers that prevent their full and effective participation in society. So on this regard, we are concerned that in this group, particularly women and girls, can be subjected to multiple and interrelated forms of discrimination. So also transversality and intersectoral approach of disability to manage public policies and to deliver the right thing to do to the different authorities in the government is very paramount. Therefore, these public policies must consider the inclusion of people with disabilities as a transversal access of planning, and in turn must consider also other situations that due to the context can generate situation of additional vulnerabilities to disability. The challenge is about leaving no one behind. This never is better applied than we speak about people with disabilities. So I conclude this intervention by reiterating the full commitment of the Mexican government to advance and consolidate the rights of people with disabilities, considering that for this task, the participation of all the actors involved in the matters will be essential. And the leadership, indeed, under the current pandemic, which has exacerbated the discrimination and the challenges that people with disability are facing, is most than ever important. Thank you very much for allowing me to approach the panel.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Delgado, for your kind words. And now we turn to our first speaker, and I would like to please ask Mrs. Michelle Funk, the Unit Head on Policy, Law, and Human Rights of the Department of Health and Substance Use of the World Health Organization, to take the floor. Please, Mrs. Funk, if you can please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It's, well, also thanks to Human Rights Watch for taking the lead in organising this side event. It really is a pleasure for WHO to be a co-sponsor and also actively contribute to this panel discussion with all our other panelists here. I'd like to start by saying that there are not many people or groups in this world that experience exclusion to the extent that people with psychosocial disabilities do. Really, their exclusion is almost total and impacts on all areas of life. Given that I'm based in the Department of Mental Health at the World Health Organization, I'm going to focus, therefore, my remarks on inclusion from the mental health perspective. And in relation to this, you know, the first point that I want to make is that many people with psychosocial disabilities are seen almost exclusively through a medical lens. So in other words, as objects of mental health care. And this goes against the very notion of inclusion in mental health care, which is about working with people holistically to ensure that all parts of their life are supported, social connections in the community, meaningful work and relationships, peer networks, and not just a narrow focus on diagnosis, treatment, and symptom reduction. The second point that I want to make now is that guardianship and mental health laws are very powerful determinants of what happens to people within the mental health care context, and often serve to prevent people from making their own decisions about their treatment and care and isolate them from community life. Inclusive mental health care, however, requires that people are able to have control and choice over the treatment, supports, and services that they are offered. Related to guardianship is, of course, the practice of institutionalization, perhaps the most overt and outwardly visible form of exclusion, which still dominates the mental health care systems in many countries around the world, isolating people from the very communities where they would otherwise be living. And again, this goes against the very notion of inclusive mental health care in which people have access without discrimination to a range of mental health and general health services and supports in the community. Services and supports which interface with social sectors such as housing, education, income generation, and social protection. And my next point is that care in the mental health sector is provided mostly, almost invariably and exclusively by mental health professionals trained in the medical model. Inclusive mental health care, however, means that people are able to benefit from the lived experience of others, in other words, peer workers, and that this lived experience should shape the services being offered in the community. So the question is, what can countries do in order to provide inclusive mental health care? And in this context, I want to mention three fundamental actions for change, which are core to the support that the World Health Organization provides countries through its Quality Rights Initiative. So one of the clear actions is that countries can provide training for key stakeholders on mental health, human rights, and disabilities in order to combat stigma, discrimination, exclusion, and other human rights violations. And WHO has developed the Quality Rights Training Program and tools in order to support countries to do this. And in fact, they are being actively used in many different countries. Another key action that countries need to take is to develop and expand community-based services and supports that respect people's rights, services that don't use coercion, services that promote recovery, that promote legal capacity, and that promote community inclusion. These services include crisis services, outreach services, hospital-based services, services in primary care, but also peer support services, supported living services, and others. And as I already said earlier, you know, it's really important that all these services form a network and interface with a very strong social sector. We are in the final stages of developing a guidance package which showcases good practice, community-based services and supports from countries all around the world. And the idea is to inspire governments to invest in the right kind of services that promote inclusion and respect rights, not ones that exclude, isolate, or resort to coercion. Thirdly, countries can also ensure that any new policy or law related to mental health which is developed respects the requirements in the CRPD. So provisions of involuntary admission and treatment need to be replaced with provisions that promote supported decision-making and advance directives. Laws need to include provisions to end institutionalization, seclusion, restraint and other practices that exclude or coerce. And policy and law need to explicitly promote community inclusion, participation, and empowerment. And, you know, in line with this, we have at the World Health Organization started the development of new guidance to support countries in this area. And finally, I want to emphasize the importance of adopting a truly inclusive and participatory process for the development and implementation of these key actions. A process that recognizes and supports people with psychosocial disabilities as the key drivers of change. So let me just conclude by saying that the importance of mental health is increasingly being recognized across the world, and it is hoped that this will be translated into action on the ground. However, most efforts to improve mental health in countries will fall short if countries don't take decisive action towards the more inclusive approach which we are highlighting in this side event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Michelle. And now I would love to give the floor to Mr. Stefan Trommel from the ILO, International Labor Organization. Sorry. Thank you. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for remembering the name of the organization. Yes. First, thank you very much for this very important side event on a very, very difficult topic, which is also the employment of persons with psychosocial disabilities, and I will focus on that. Having said that, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities highlights the interrelatedness of all the different rights. And I think this is particularly relevant in this context, because if all the issues that Michelle has just described, if they're not solved, if persons with psychosocial disabilities continue to be deprived of their legal capacity, continue to be locked away in institutions, continue to lack community support, and employment is not even an option. No? So we really need, and I really would like to recognize and compliment the amazing work that Michelle Funk is doing in the WHO. Quality rights is an amazing tool, and WHO is leading the change in the thinking about mental health. It's also revising its own sometimes outdated policies. So I think it's an amazing work that is being done. But let me not go away with the excuse that unless this is solved, we cannot do anything in the context of employment. And I will focus on employment in the private sector because we are doing a lot of work with that in the International Labour Organization. First, I would like to say that where we have statistics, and we don't always have statistics, and very often they're only by disability, but not by subgroup, but still we can say without too much risk of being wrong that persons with psychosocial disabilities are within the group of persons with disabilities those that are faced with the lowest level of labor market participation. In general, we always say that people with disabilities face prejudice and stigma by employers, by society in general, to be fair. And that is even more the case, even more profound in the context of persons with psychosocial disabilities. I would also like to raise an issue with you, which we sometimes struggle with when we are looking at psychosocial disability in the employment context, is who are we talking about? And I want to make like two groups, because to some extent there are some differences between both groups. On one hand, we are persons who have some mental health condition. They might define themselves or not as having a psychosocial disability. They would usually have perhaps a less severe mental health condition, but still have a mental health condition. And they will probably already be working, and probably would be working without having disclosed their condition. And I'll come back to that. And secondly, we have a group of persons with probably more severe mental health conditions who are not yet working, and whose entry in the labor market will require a level of support that is more intensive than that the first group requires. Now, for both groups, we definitely need an environment that is stigma-free. We need to promote organizations that are openly speaking about mental health conditions. Because if we continue to work in an environment where mental health is associated with stigma, then this first group, persons that are already working in our organizations, might, and if they require, for instance, some form of workplace adjustment, they would not request that workplace adjustment because they are concerned about disclosing their disability, because they might think that that disclosure would not only not lead to being provided with an adjustment, but might perhaps lead to them being invited to find a job somewhere else. And so we really need to address that situation. And I think the best way to address that situation is to promote a stigma-free environment, but at the same time also to protect these requests of workplace adjustment to ensure full confidentiality and privacy. At the same time, we also need to recognize that the whole concept of workplace adjustment, reasonable accommodation, as it is defined by the UN Convention, is still a concept that is largely unknown in many countries. And it's even less known how to apply workplace adjustment, reasonable accommodation in the context of persons with psychosocial disabilities. It's not rocket science, in fact, but there is very little guidance that governments give to employers, trade unions, persons with disability themselves on how to apply the concept of reasonable accommodation to persons with psychosocial disabilities. At the same time, we need to think about persons with more severe mental health conditions, which severe, let's say, psychosocial disabilities, because we cannot leave them out of the labor market. But here we are in a different context. We are not speaking about persons, here we are speaking about persons whose disability is probably out in the public. It is there. And the employer will know that that person has this condition, and that person is requiring some more intensive support in order to be able to effectively be included in the labor market. So we are talking about a different context. There are a number of countries where we have what we call individual placement and support, IPS systems, which is very much based on the approach of supported employment, which is basically a person with a disability, intellectual or psychosocial, is supported by a job coach in the initial stages of the employment, is helped to understand the job. There's some mediation there with his line manager, or his or her line manager, with the co-workers, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say an intensive support is being provided to that person. But as I said, the disability is visible and is open, a different situation from the one that I described before. Carlos, you will be happy to hear that I'm coming to an end of my presentation. Let me just say one final word, which is about COVID-19. Now, probably, and I might be wrong, one of the few positive outcomes of COVID-19 is that mental health is coming a bit more out of the closet. I think right now, all the mental health considerations and impacts that COVID-19 is producing on the general population is making all of us to speak more openly about mental health conditions. It is more frequently possible now to ask each other, how are you doing? How are you struggling with the current situation? And I think that bringing out the mental health out of the closet hopefully will open up and will make organizations to be better prepared to include persons with disabilities, both with more severe and less severe and I apologize for using that term, but just to try to make things a bit more visible, persons with psychosocial disabilities. So I hope that COVID-19 perhaps can help us to make our organizations, to make employers better prepared to fully and effectively welcome persons with psychosocial disabilities in the labor market. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you so much for being so right on time. Well, our next speaker is Hawa Ohefo. Ms. Hawa Ohefo is an activist and the first fellow, Human Rights Watch fellow, Marka Bristow fellow. And I will ask Hawa, please, to take the floor. She'll speak about participation, the role of people with psychosocial disabilities on the disability movement. Thank you so much, Hawa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Hello, everyone. My name is Hawa Ohefo, and I am the founder and executive director here at She Writes Woman. And we're a movement that gives mental health a voice in Nigeria by empowering people who actually live with mental health conditions to tell their own stories, co-create their own solutions, and advocate for their own rights. And we do this by creating safe spaces for people to tell their own stories and by talking about mental health often enough so that we can normalize mental health conversations. And as Carlos has mentioned, I am the inaugural Human Rights Watch Marka Bristow Fellow, an honor that I do not take lightly at all, so thank you very much. She Writes Women and I particularly have been very active within the policy advocacy and legislative advocacy space in Nigeria, as far as advocating for human rights, respect, and mental health legislation or policies in Nigeria. I definitely and openly identify as a person who lives with a mental health condition and psychosocial disability. So it is something that is incredibly personal to me and personal to my constituents as well. Since 2018, we have worked with Human Rights Watch to research on the ground here in Nigeria human rights violations of persons with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities in healing camps. We're talking about shackling and chaining, as you've probably read in the report that was released just about a month or two ago. Earlier this year, I made a landmark appearance before the Nigerian Senate Committee on Health, which is the Nigerian Parliament, on why it's important for legislators to robustly consult persons with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities in creating legislation and laws in Nigeria, and why they must strive to ensure that they have full compliance with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD, and just generally reiterating, reinforcing the tenets of this very important convention, which is nothing about us without us. But in talking about really the participation of persons with mental health conditions, really the inclusion of persons with mental health conditions, I think we must first understand the layers of exclusion of persons with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities. And how I see it is, if I look within my environment here in Nigeria, there are layers of exclusion. So even within the disability space, persons with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities are very often excluded from conversations that have to do with them, from decisions, from policy making, from legislation, and from even being able to determine and co-create of some sort their own care paths. So this is very interesting because until we understand the intricacies of that bit of exclusion, then we might not be able to make a whole lot of progress in, being able to go through these layers in terms of putting in layers of inclusion. So one of the things that, a couple of things that we have definitely seen that needs to work is reorientation. If we do not begin to turn the wheels on how mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities are perceived in many countries like Nigeria, then we lose the key engine, the human capital of galvanizing, the disabilities rights movement and also the inclusion of persons with mental health conditions. Because it is not enough and very much in line with the nothing about us without us. It is not enough that we have these conversations. It is how are we, the people who live with mental health conditions, being at the forefront of this? How are we championing this? How are we being consulted? Are you listening to us when we say this is what support looks like? This is what inclusion looks like. So we are losing out on that. And it's so important that we are addressing it from key factors. For example, we need to look at the cultural barriers to, participation of persons with psychosocial disabilities. In many cultures in Nigeria, people cannot even talk about their mental health, not to even talk about, seeking some form of support or being able to even identify in a way that, they want to be actively and publicly involved in the movement. We want to also look at religious barriers as well. Nigeria, for example, is a very religious country, and we need to understand how we can find an intersection with religious leaders, whether it's traditional religion or the more common religions like Christianity and Islam, in ensuring that we're having these conversations in those settings as well. We also want to break social stigmas as well. And I believe it's really about thinking about norm, because norm is really what we make normal. And if a certain kind of norm is not working, then it means that we have transcended that norm and it's time to create new norms. So it's so important for us to begin to retell new stories and, change narratives around mental health. And lastly, I'll talk about legislative barriers. We forget that the people that we put in power, the people who are our leaders, the people that make our laws, these legislators are people that are from the society. So it's so important that when we are actually creating, we're talking about inclusion of persons with mental health conditions, starting at a narrative perspective, that we realize how important it is to reach far and wide the grassroots in every society. Because at the end of the day, this is where the leaders actually come from. These are the legislators. They will not put forward legislation or laws that they do not know about, that they do not know enough about. There is so much that needs to go into reorientation, awareness, and I mean deliberate and intentional reorientation and awareness of key positions in power to ensure that, people with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities feel comfortable, confident enough to publicly participate in this movement and to publicly feel included. Because it's one thing to invite people, it's another thing to make sure that they feel like they belong in that space. So that is what we need. We need deliberate and intentional approaches on the grassroots level, on a granular level, but also on a legislative level, so that persons with psychosocial disabilities know that their rights are being protected and promoted and preserved at every single stage. And that is one of the key barriers that Nigeria is facing when you talk about a country that had its last mental health legislation in 1958, and that is the Lunacy Act, everything that the UNCRPD stands against. So it's so important that I reinforce, nothing about us without us. We cannot do this, on a local level, an international level, whether at the legislative level or the social level, without deliberate attempts and intentional attempts to break these barriers, which form layers of exclusion, and ensure that we're deliberately putting back layers of inclusion. So I hope that I've been able to give a bit of a context, especially with Nigeria, on how we are addressing the inclusion of persons with mental health conditions in participating in the disabilities rights movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hawa, for that super interesting intervention. And now we're going to turn to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Katia D'Artigues, who is a very well-known journalist that covers disability rights in Mexico. So please, Katia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you so much to everyone. Journalists and media workers inherit the prejudice that the society they serve. However, they or we have a social responsibility to use correct and inclusive language that does not stigmatize, stereotype, or trivialize people with psychosocial disabilities. I will refer not only to professional journalism that is going under a crisis, a world crisis, but also other forms of media, including television, films, magazines, social media, and advertising. What are the problems? Well, we tend to represent people with psychosocial disabilities through exaggerated, inaccurate, and supposedly comical images. We frequently portray or write about them in op-eds and refer to people with psychiatric disorders or mental health conditions as persons who are violent, murderous, unpredictable, or just plain wrong, according to us, of course. It is particularly difficult in my experience to get through to the cartoonists, the social media influencers, or people who have comedy programs that vindicate their right to freedom of expression, or are convinced that humor can only be successful if it is made through stereotypes. There's also, of course, a gender bias. Women are overrepresented as people with neurosis or sexual dysfunctions, and they call this a mental health condition. This is a common practice. It is difficult to find texts that frame mental conditions as a societal issue. Maybe just depression, like Stefan Trommel said. I think in this COVID pandemic, no, we have learned to talk more about this, and especially depression and things related to COVID. And I think this will be a good step forward of coming out of the closet. I love that expression. The common coverage in the media includes blaming an individual for their condition, no? Reaffirming the stereotype that people with psychosocial disabilities or conditions are criminal and violent. They also look different, of course, no? Maybe they disheveled hair, the rumpled clothes, the wild eyes is Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest all over again. If not dangerous, they are childish and silly. We mock people with obsessive compulsive disorder or dissociative identity in movies or TV shows. We tend to portray people with psychosocial conditions as all alike, all severe, and normally we do not write, talk, or show about recovery and the steps to do that. We mention the disability when it's not relevant for the piece. And in films or Mexican telenovelas, of course, they are normally the villain who gets thrown into a psychiatric hospital for good as a punishment for their wickedness. No? So what to do? I've been a writer, TV and radio journalist for 27 years now. Almost 2 years ago, I founded with a colleague who is also the mother of a child with a disability, a special news outlet, also a nonprofit organization where we cover disabilities, all types of disabilities. Our webpage is Yo También.mx. In our experience, 3 things work. First, one-on-one conversations. We journalists, we are normally, how to say this, a little self-centered, conceited, somewhat divas. So this works. When you talk to a colleague one-on-one and express the whys and why nots of certain media coverage or opinions, they listen. This is, of course, ant work. We also try to invite them to write with us, and in the editing of their piece, we say our piece. We also encourage organizations of people with disabilities to write letters to them or make their point in social media. This is very important. Normally, if the approach is correct, they tend to listen and realize that they are confused or using the wrong words without thinking or overthinking them. Mexico is very common to refer to people with disabilities as people with different capacities, no? Or, you know, special needs, or because it sounds better. But normally they do not have people with psychosocial disabilities in the radar as people with disabilities. They do not. But if you feed them, if you feed us a good story, and this world is filled with stories worth writing about, we will write. The second thing that works in my experience is to encourage journalists to get to know the people they are writing about. This sounds so, well, of course, no? But nothing disarms more than meeting the person you are writing about. And normally, and I hate to say this about people in my profession, we do not make that contact. And 3, punctual manuals and short courses. Journalists in lots of countries are overworked, underpaid, and want to know right now, what do you expect of them? No, I know several manuals in Spain, the US, through the National Center on Disability and Journalism of the University of Arizona, and of course, Mexico. I did the foreword for one of them. But normally they are too long, academic, and most journalists normally read what they absolutely need to read because they are overworked. We need to work with editors too. Maybe you have convinced the reporter he did or she did or they did a great job, but the editor can undo what you worked for. Exceptions, of course, exist. Normally, there are persons who are related to the community of people with disabilities. They have a son, a daughter, and a sister, a brother, a mother, a father, uncle, and with disabilities. With them and other people who would like to write well and in a good perspective about disabilities and people with social disabilities. It is my dream to make a network of journalists that can work together and can also report things together. Maybe it's too much work for one media to do an investigation, no? So we can work together with one or two or several and publish them together. In Yo También, we are at the first step to create such a manual, small course, and further network. We do need sponsors to do that. So if you know one, send her, him, or they their way. So this is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Katia for that interesting perspective on how media can overstep barriers for people with disabilities. And now our next speaker is Diana Sheinbaum, that comes from the organization Documenta, that has a very interesting program in access to justice for people with psychosocial disabilities in Mexico. So Diana, you have the floor.
Thanks, Carlos. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to participate in this panel. My name is Diana Sheinbaum, and I work as a coordinator of the Disability and Justice Program at Documenta, a Mexican NGO that for the past 10 years has focused on understanding the barriers faced by individuals with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities in the criminal justice system and trying to figure out some alternatives to overcome those barriers and make the criminal justice system inclusive and accessible. I wish I could say that the ratification of the UN CRPD by Mexico 12 years ago has had an impact in the way in which persons with disability interact with the justice system. However, in our experience in the field, providing accommodations in judicial processes where persons with disabilities act as both victims and suspects, and our conversations with the criminal justice system personnel, this shed light on the contrary. What have we seen? In the last 10 years, we have witnessed many cases of persons with disabilities who have been unfairly and wrongfully treated due to their disability. We have frequently seen people who have been detained and imprisoned based on their disability. We have been seeing people declare unfit to stand in trial, but nevertheless sent to a psychiatric jail without the opportunity to be heard by a court. People who are in pretrial detention for months or even years waiting for psychiatric assessments, even when the crime they are accused for is, for example, taking a bug repellent from a neighbor house. People who are in jail without knowing what were they accused for or how long will they be there. We've also met people who spend more time in prison than their peers without disability because the system is based, as everyone has said here, on the general misconception and prejudice that people with psychosocial disability pose a greater risk to themselves and to others, and therefore it is necessary and justified to impose greater restrictions on their liberties. With persons with disabilities, fundamental rights such as the presumption of innocence are almost a luxury and are denied in practice when the disability is identified. So people with psychosocial disabilities face many, many barriers to access justice. The restrictions on the exercise of their legal capacity, the lack of information in accessible formats, negative attitudes questioning their abilities to participate during all stages of the judicial process, the lack of legal aid and representations for people who are living in institutions such as psychiatric hospitals or drug clinics, and of course, lack of training for professionals working in the field of justice. It is true that in Mexico, the criminal legislation, particularly the Procedural Criminal Code changed after the ratification of the CRPD and incorporated the obligation of providing accommodations. Although this reform opened an important window of opportunity, I have to say that it has remained on the paper. In 2017, and recognizing this obligation of the state to provide for procedural accommodations, Documenta launched a pilot program in Mexico City to implement these adaptations in criminal courts. We were not sure if the program would be welcomed by judges or even if we had work, because in Mexico, statistics on how many people with disabilities are in the criminal justice system show that less than 2% of the population in prison have a disability. However, very soon our participation as facilitators or intermediaries increase. Today, after almost 3 years, we have participated in more than 1,500 criminal hearings where people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities participate. Through this work, we have had the chance to be inside the system and realize the obstacles that face people with psychosocial disabilities to access justice in equal conditions. We have realized that being identified with a psychosocial disability becomes clearly a disadvantage in the system because the reasons we have stated here today, mainly the stigma, the prejudice and misconceptions that influence judge decisions every day. The limitations to legal capacity through these declarations of unfitness to stand in trial based solely in psychiatric examinations. The system has this inertia when they meet people with disabilities to say, no, they can't, nor not what can we do so they can. The deprivation of liberty based on disability with no due process guarantee is frequent in Mexico and in many countries. We've met a woman accused of theft who 20 years later was still in prison because she had no family to pick her up or institutions where to send her. So it's very worrisome, the lack of due process guarantees and how institutionalizations seems to become the first answer that the system has. It is also perverse to think that for many people, the criminal justice system is the only time when they have felt the state intervention. Many of the individuals we've met share trajectories of segregation, exclusion, and lack of opportunities, and this has resulted in a higher risk to be involved with the system. As Michelle has said, the lack of services and programs in the communities, the lack of opportunities, the lack of job, the lack of education increases the chances for persons with psychosocial disabilities to keep falling into the system. We need to invest on those services outside the criminal justice system if inclusion and leaving no one behind or locked up is our goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diana, for your remarks on access to justice for people with psychosocial disabilities in Mexico, and the very interesting program you're running. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Leron David. She's the Director of International Relations and Development, ENOSH, the Israeli Mental Health Association. Please, Leron, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos and Human Rights Watch, for organizing this event, and to all the panelists and partners for this fascinating discussion and tireless work to promote inclusion for people with psychosocial disabilities around the world. With me today are Gabi and Rivka and their beautiful daughter, Noah. A photo of them is part of my Zoom background behind me, as well as a logo of ENOSH. And I will get to their story in a minute. In my presentation here, I want to highlight the angle of inclusive community-based mental health services using the example of ENOSH, the Israeli Mental Health Association model. For many years, we are providing a basket of mental health services which are based on the Israeli Community Rehabilitation Law and funded by the Ministry of Health. ENOSH's work is focused on the primary aspects of life, housing, employment, social life, and family support. Our recovery services aim to support the inclusion of people with psychosocial disabilities in society and help our society and different communities within it to be aware of their role in inclusion. We do that by promoting public awareness to mental health issues and psychosocial disabilities, creating connections and activities with the community, and bringing the community to our daily activities. We also use our knowledge regarding barriers to social services to reduce them through recovery programs, self-advocacy, and organizational advocacy. To support people in their recovery journey towards maintaining fulfilling lives, we provide holistic mental health services, as I mentioned, in areas of housing, employment, recreation, social and healthy life, and support the family members. The services are tailored to the person's needs and can differ according to all kinds of life events. Some people need support in specific points of time and others at different times. Each person has their own story, knowledge, needs, and dreams. All these can be promoted through a culture that relies on lived experience. This issue is embedded in our services. So thanks to this support system and model, we helped Gabi and Rivka, they are in the background, with their life journey. 6 years ago, they met at a social center in Enosh. They came to our activities provided with supportive housing, with employment opportunities, and even enjoyed, when it was possible before COVID, they even enjoyed vacation with other friends, created a community of peers in Enosh Center, and went with them in Enosh activities, but also in their life independently. At some point, they fell in love with each other and decided to get married. Planning their wedding was a meaningful event for them and for Enosh team that supported them. And the process was full of challenges. We always talk about recovery as a journey that we need to get a fulfilling life, but the journey there is full of challenges, as life are, and even more in the wedding day. So after that, when they decided to become parents, Enosh team helped them with other barriers of accessing support from networks and social services, and help with the barriers to access the right to family life that many people with disabilities, all the disabilities, but specifically psychosocial disabilities, are confronted with. So Rivka gave birth to 2 beautiful children, and Enosh team was there for her and for Gabi more intensively at the time when they needed. Today, they live in an independent apartment, in their own apartment, and have a meaningful family and social life with Enosh support. They say that Enosh centers are their second home, and it is not always easy to live with a psychosocial disability and to be connected to the services around you. There are many waves and challenges through the life events, but we are there for them whenever they need us. And I think that promoting inclusion in mental health services requires listening to persons' needs, using lived experience in the organization culture, and using the community and networks to change the reality of exclusion. So I hope you learned a little bit about what we do in Israel, and I thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Liron, for that great presentation about the work you're doing in Israel. And I would like to remind the public that if you want to make questions, please do type them in the text box, and we'll have a small time slot at the end, and you can ask for the floor to ask some specific questions. Our next speaker is Mr. Vincent Girard. He works at the Public Health Research Unit at the MRC University. And he is going to talk about implementing different types of good practices on mental health services and a platform they have to achieve that. Thank you, Vincent. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everybody to be there. I'm going to talk about using the knowledge already there first. Us and them. I am 48 years old and I have been working in the field of mental health since the age of 26 as a physician. Making diagnoses is one of the first things we learn. In psychiatry, this categorization exercise is different from other specialties such as oncology or infectious disease. Apart because there is no diagnostic certainty for the person making the diagnosis. There is no evidence, symptoms, or biological test. We do not know the origin of the problem either. Psychiatric illness have unclear clinical contour. Psychiatric diagnoses are considered to have a weak scientific basis. Many people in my family have had mental health problems. I myself have fallen ill twice in recent years. For a long time, I believed that there was the normal on one side and the crazy or disabled on the others, us and them. And that I was on the side of the us, the normal. It was when I started working on psychotraumatism in theory and in my personal life that I understood that we are all at some point in our lives at risk of developing an experience of psychological suffering beyond our adaptive capacities. I came to consider that competition, individualism, social Darwinism, and repeated social defeat have been a breeding ground for the social construction of these us and them categories, much more than a reasonable and scientific approach. Some governments, such as Belgium, and coalitions such as Global Mental Health, now argue that solutions should no longer be organized around diagnosis categories. I also believe that as long as we individually believe in this frontier, it will remain present collectively. The right to live at home. I worked as a street psychiatrist for 13 years in Marseille, in France. Homeless people quickly told me, we need a home, not a psychiatrist or doctor. With a small group of motivated people, including street people, and the support of many associations, we opened a squat in 2007. At the time, there was a strong social movement around housing and the fight against homelessness. We managed to convince the government to develop a housing first research program that had been evaluated abroad for more than 20 years. This French research program developed in 4 cities has produced sufficient scientific evidence on the superior cost effectiveness of this type of intervention compared to the usual offer. In 2017, the government was convinced by its result and decided to change the public policy to fight homelessness. It decided to conduct a housing first policy for people living on the street with severe mental disorder, and also for all homeless people. We have to use the knowledge already there. When our little band started this research project, the vast majority of people working to fight homelessness were opposed to this new way of doing things. Today, everyone agrees that is the best policy to pursue. Barely 10 years have passed. Opinions and policy can change much faster than we imagine. To avoid being caught up in our collective emotions, in our fear about change, the scientific approach is an essential tool. Our society produces an ever increasing amount of knowledge than we cannot use. In mental health, the discovery of the last 50 years have been incredible in cognitive science, educational science, therapeutics, and social interventions. On the dozen of good practice have been evaluated, and today we not only know the solution to many problems, but we are also able to say how and how much more effective it is than the usual offer. For example, we know that it's more effective to treat a people with a serious mental disorder at home than in the hospital. We also know that the psychiatric hospital is a place where a lot of kind of violence take place against patients, and that it aggravates a number of psychic health problems. We know that it's more useful to offer a person a job in a regular environment for their recovery rather than offer them care and treatment first. We are aware of many programs that can facilitate the recovery of skill of people with serious psychic problems. We know how to run an effective addiction policy. We know how to develop a urban environment that fosters social connectedness. Finally, and most incredibly, we know how to prevent the appearance of many mental disorder and addiction by intervening early in the life of babies and children through psychosocial skill development program. It is noted that all these discoveries are more respectful to the rights of the people. There is a missing link between scientists and the world. Yet we invest all our energy in financing things that don't work, mainly psychiatric hospital and psychotropic treatment. I worked 3 years and 4 months in a regional health agency in France. I just finished this last work 3 months ago. My main mission was to develop a mental health policy. More than 80% of the budget was used to finance bad practice, and less than 10% was used for good practice. I realized how it's difficult for a large majority of actors, professionals, patients, family funders, policymakers to identify good practice. One of the main reasons for this is that many actors who are often perceived as legitimate participate in the construction of ignorance. They defend their practice and or their personal collective interest, but not the common interest. They also find it difficult to see how they could change their practice. It seems to them more costly in terms of effort to defend their practice, even bad ones, than to change them. Users also find it difficult to find adequate answer to their problem and end up accepting the proposed offer because they are unable to legitimize a different demand. Journalists also find it difficult to find their way around and participate also in the dissemination of bad information.
Vincent,
there is also another
Can you start wrapping up, please? Thank you. We are pressed about the time. Thanks.
There is also another more classic reason. Scientists are generally no great communicator. They often express themselves with an incomprehensible vocabulary and sometimes get lost in the details. Added to this, there are language and cultural barriers. In 2018, the French government decided to set up mental health policy by local area that will be built by the local actors themselves. In order to help them identify good practice, a community of researchers, activists, users, associations, and caregivers and mental health professionals took the initiative to build a platform to support good practice. This platform has 3 objectives: identify good practice, assess their level of evidence, make them accessible to all those who need them in order to implement them. In order to ensure the accessibility of the information, we work with 2 journalists with the objective of having an approach that's easy to read and understand. The choice of good practice was made through a cross method of literature review, political with to disseminate them, and field team able to train other team wishing to implement them. We hypothesize that alliance between users, association, researcher, and caregiver, health and social professional, and decision maker around the construction and animation of such a platform can facilitate the dissemination and the implementation of this good practice in a lot of different areas all over the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you so much, Vincent, for your very interesting presentation. We're gonna give space now for some of the questions that our public has been sending, and I'm gonna read 2 of them. And I apologize if we are not able to to answer all of them. But well, the first one is, how can we institute policies to all our panelists? How can we institute policies that advocate for autonomy and human rights for those with psychosocial disabilities on a local level in the United States, particularly given opposition from religious groups? This is the first one. Also, there's another one. Can someone speak about the links between the pharmaceutical industry, insurance, and healthcare providers in relation to psychosocial disabilities? Does anyone care to take those? Any of those? Thank you.
I can try.
Okay. Michelle, can you?
Okay.
Michelle and Vincent?
Yes. Well, I'll just make a few comments on the first question that you mentioned, Carlos, and that was how are we going to advocate for different sorts of policies that are, are promoting autonomy and other rights? And I think the question is, how do we not only advocate for new types of policies, but make sure that they have impact on the ground? And I think the second part of that sort of question was that there is resistance from different groups to realizing legal capacity, autonomy, and participation. So I don't think it's just resistance from faith-based organizations or certain organizations, but there's a lot of resistance from different pockets in the community. And that resistance really stems from lack of awareness, lack of understanding. There are too many people who misinterpret what the CRPD is saying. People are saying, oh, if someone wants to go and harm themselves, oh, we just let them do it. But no, that's not what the CRPD is saying. So there's a lot of misconceptions, lack of understanding out there. And fundamentally, in order to address this, we need to work at different levels. And that was what I was trying to say in my presentation. We need to work deep in the community at changing attitudes and practices and all the different stakeholder groups. So everyone has a much better understanding that really connects with them about the issue of psychosocial disability and what can be realized in order to promote autonomy and rights. And we do need to work at the service level to make sure supports are available in the community in line with what people want to see, want to receive, and then also directly at the policy and law level. But fundamental to everything is changing attitudes, mindsets, because if you don't change that, you'll just perpetuate bad policies, bad laws, bad services. And even if there are some good policies, laws, and services that, well, policies and laws in paper, they won't get implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have two other speakers that want to weigh in there. Vincent, please, you have the floor.
Yes, for the first question, I think one of the main problem is that policymakers and people need to understand the different level of efficacy of different policies, and they don't know it, and so they are lost, and they don't know how to choose. And for example, we know that if you have to choose between going to have a psychiatric meeting with a psychiatrist and to have access to EPS, international work support in normal life, it's better for your life. But in reality, it's easier to have a psychiatric meeting. It's quasi impossible to have access to the good services who exist in theory but not in practice. And for the question about the link between the pharmaceutical industry and insurance and more broadly the role of this industry, the problem is that scientific data shows that chemical treatment do not work on the long term for people. It's helpful for crisis, it's helpful at short term, but it's not in comparison with social or psychological intervention. there is no comparison. It's less efficient.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Katia, you wanted to weigh in on this question?
Yes, as a journalist, I think we need to make a better storytelling of all that we have talked about based on what the structure that Leon made, no? Tell the story of a specific couple or individual in particular, and telling the public how can we make this change possible, and help scientific and academic professionals to tell story in the media with how to say this in practically as in so can everyone can understand. We need to download the level of the legal and the scientific and so more people can understand, and also tell stories about how can these community-based programs and all those things can be made, and the stories that I have already proven that this is possible.
Thank you so much, Katia. Hawa wants to weigh in on the question about religious groups, so I'll give her the floor. Thank you very, very briefly because we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Hawa.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So I think the issue of religion in the context of mental health and psychosocial disabilities is very important. I believe one of the things that we need to do more as players in this space is also mainstream our awareness, because a lot of times we're doing a lot of legislative work, but not enough work on the ground with spaces that people spend the most time in. So we need to do a lot of work with ensuring that key stakeholders like religious leaders, traditional leaders, traditional healing centers, if that's part of the norm or culture in a particular space, that they are very much included in, in the process of creating awareness, in the consultation on how best to reach people in the language they understand, and how, it can be a win-win. Because we see a lot of pushback when it comes to, addressing religion in new spaces where it feels like we're bringing something new to this space where we feel like, oh, our definition of God is, something most supreme. So we don't want anything, somewhat being in conflict with that. So I believe it's very important that we're mainstreaming, how we approach this inclusion on all levels, in order to get it to become all mainstream. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hawa. And well, unfortunately, our time is over. And I would like to thank all of the speakers, all the organizations that participated putting this together, the government of Mexico again for making this event possible. And saying that, I wish you the best of mornings, of afternoons or nights. And we will be seeing you soon. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much.